Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at nun, freut, euch, lieben, Christen, gmein, which translates to, Dear Christians, one and all, rejoice. Fairly straightforward chorale. There is a little section in here which reminds me that needs to be F natural. This is really the only section that caused me any analytical issue. I think there are a couple of different takes one could have about this little section here, but other than that, it's a fairly straightforward chorale, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have one sharp in the key signature, we start on G major, we end on G major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G major. So that is our one chord, passing tones in the lower voices before we get B, G, D, and G, which is just taking our one chord and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone in the bass here, and then we get a 5 chord D major with a passing 7th in the bass. That's D, F sharp, A, and D. And that takes us right back to a 1/6 chord B, G, D, and G. We then get A, F sharp, A, and C. This G, I think, is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. Those are relatively common over 7/6 chords, and that's going to take us to 1 in root position. Typically when we have 1 going to 7/6, we usually have a 1 chord on the other side. Not always, but the vast majority of the time. And that's also true of the retrograde of that progression, 1, 7, 6, 1, 6. G, G, D, and B. We then have this B here, which takes the chord and puts it in first inversion. And then as we're getting ready for our perfect authentic cadence, we have D, G, D, and A. Very common to get 4/3 suspensions over our 5 chord. A little delayed passing 7th here in the alto. And then we cadence on G major. G, D, B, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase is interesting. We have this C sharp here, which starts the phrase off kind of interestingly. So I think one way we could analyze this is as a 2 chord, right? We have E, we have G, we have B, and we have G, which is E minor in root position. However, I think this C sharp is actually quite a bit more interesting than the B, and I think this C sharp is actually the root of this chord. So with that in mind, with this C sharp being the leading tone of D, we know that this is 7/6 of 5, because C sharp is the leading tone to D, and C sharp diminished is the leading tone chord to D major, and that of course takes us to a 5 chord D, F sharp, D, and A. So it resolves the way we would expect. And then we get to this next chord here, where we have G sharp, F natural, and B along with this D. So that would be a G sharp fully diminished 7th chord over D. However, I do think we get a very slight, short modulation to the key of A minor here. And the main reason why is because we have a melodic minor fragment here in the tenor, F sharp, G sharp, and A. But the one problem with that modulation is the fact that I think the chord that we're resolving to is morphing in terms of its function, and I'll talk about that when we get to that chord. So I still think we modulate to the key of A minor. We have seen this in the past in Bach, and then on the end of the beat we have G sharp fully diminished 7th over D, which would be 7/4/3. So 4 going to a 7, very straightforward progression, as opposed to 5 going to 7 of 2, then going to 2, which would be a roundabout way of saying what's happening here. But I do think we resolve to 1. But what's happening at the same time on the beat actually alludes to the more likely progression of what's happening in G major, because I think even though this is a 4/7/1 progression in the key of A minor, and yes, this is a 2-beat visitation to the key of A minor. I know it's on the shorter side, but when I see melodic minor going on here, it makes me feel like we've passed the threshold into what would constitute a modulation rather than just a tonicization. And the progression just, to me, makes more narrative sense when thinking in terms of A minor rather than thinking about it purely in terms of G major, thinking about this as a tonicization of 5, then a tonicization of 2. This feels like a tonicization of 5, which then blends into an A minor fragment. That's just how I look at it. Of course, there are multiple ways to look at what's happening here, but I think even more interesting than this progression here is the role of this F sharp, because if we look at the chord on the next beat, we have G major in first inversion. We have B, D, G, and B. So we know that this is some type of 1/6 chord in the key of G major. So if we were moving purely to the key of G major here and looking at what was happening on the harmonic rhythm, this would be some type of 2 chord. But I think what's important to bear in mind is the fact that I think this F sharp is actually the root of the chord. So even though it's functioning as A minor in the key of A minor, I think this chord is also functioning as F sharp diminished in the key of G major. So we've seen this idea of either tonicizing 2/7, right? Bach plays with 2 and 7 being the same chord, or being similar in terms of their pitch content in the past. You know, we see it here. We see that this chord could be analyzed as an A minor 7 chord, but we know the F sharp is most likely the root of the chord because it's the object of it's the resolution of this suspension. Whereas the F sharp here is a little bit more subtle, and perhaps we are creating a 2/7 progression here. But it feels like Bach is actually moving to 2, which then morphs into 7. It doesn't quite feel like a progression. I'm of the mindset, and if you've watched my videos in the past, you might have encountered me saying this. I'm of the mindset that I think more than one voice needs to move in order to constitute a chord progression. Like when the voice changes inversion because one voice moves, that's one thing. But when we have one voice moving, and that's the difference between a 2 chord and a 7 chord, I feel like really it's not a chord progression, more so a morphing of one chord into the next, because the property that chords that are a third apart from one another share is the fact that they have 2 tones in common, and the only difference is a step apart, a diatonic step that is. So in this case it's a whole step, but in other cases it could be a half step. So whether this is 2 or whether this is 7/6, I think Bach knows that 2 and 7 are very similar to one another, and it would be much more common for 7/6 to go to 1/6, just like we saw earlier. It's much more common to see 7 resolve to 1 rather than 2 to go to 1. So I feel like this is a case where it's difficult to know exactly what the non-chord tone is. I think for the sake of A minor, the F sharp is the non-chord tone, but for the sake of G major, the E is the non-chord tone. So it's difficult to say exactly which chord is being intended by Bach here. But I think from an analytical standpoint, our expectations are kind of, it's on the fence in terms of, our expectations are that, the 7/6 chord is going to go to 1, but we have 2 and 7 sort of happening at the same time. And we've seen this idea of 2 morphing into 7, or 7 being tonicized in the past as well. So this isn't the first time we've encountered this, but this is definitely the most interesting part of the chorale. Whether you analyze this as a modulation or not, this is definitely an interesting chord happening here, where 2 is sort of morphing into 7. But the rest of the chorale is fairly straightforward. We have passing tones in the lower voices here: D, F sharp, G, and A. We know a 5 chords being implied here. We don't quite get a suspension. Oh, sorry, this isn't a G, this is a D. Yeah, D. I would expect a 4/3 suspension over the the dominant chord, but no, we get this interesting leap down. A is a chord tone, B is a passing tone before we get C, G, C, and E, which is C major. A bit of an interesting progression here. That's 4. it's very uncommon for us to see 5 go to 4 in root position. It's much more common to see them in 5 go to like 4-6 or 5-6 go to 4-6, that sort of thing, but to see them in root position is a little rare. Passing 7th in the bass, we then have A, C, and F sharp, which is F sharp diminished over A, 7-6, and that takes us to 1 G major. So we have a perfect authentic cadence that doesn't use the 5 chord at the end of a section too, which is pretty interesting from a formals perspective. Hi everyone, sorry for another interruption, but I realized the tenor line here was copied incorrectly in my score, so I had to reprint it. We're just going to hop right into the next phrase. It ends in the key of D major. We start off with the G major chord, so we don't need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass, we then have E, G, and C. C major over E, that's 4-6. F sharp, D, A, and C, which is like a passing 5-6-5 chord. D7 over F sharp, and that takes us to G major. G, D, A, and B. G being the resolution to our 9/8 suspension here, which is very common over tonic functioning chords. I think this is where we modulate to the key of D as well. This is now our 4 chord. While passing 7th here, we get C sharp on the next beat, where we have G, C sharp, E, and A, which is 5-4-2, A7 over G. A is a chord tone, G is a chord tone, and even though the resolution isn't happening immediately after, I would say the next beat of the harmonic rhythm is really where the modulation is happening. Or sorry, not the modulation. The resolution is happening, where we would expect to go to D major in root position, first inversion, which we do. F sharp, D, A, and D. 1-6. Typically 4-2 chords resolve down a fifth in terms of their roots, and the bass resolves down by step. So 5-4-2 to 1-6, 6-4-2 to 2-6, etc. B is a non-chord tone, and F sharp is a chord tone. I think this is a little root position B minor chord, which is our 6th chord in the key of D major, and that's going to lead us right into our cadence. We have G, B, E, and D, which is E minor 7 over G, which is 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. That takes us to A7, A, G, and C sharp. Kind of looks like it's going to be a like a 7-6 suspension situation, but it's not exactly. I think this is sort of like a false suspension, at least when you look at it on the page and you're not really listening. You would expect this to be a 7-6 suspension, but with the C sharp and the melody, that would be turning a 5-7 chord into a 3 chord, which doesn't really have as much like cadential heft. It doesn't really bring the phrase to an end. But F sharp's a non-chord tone, E is a chord tone, and that takes us to D major. D, A, F sharp, and D. Tonic triad, root position. We're going to stay in the key of G major for the rest of the chorale. Our penultimate phrase ends with a deceptive cadence. That's pretty cool. I think D here is also operating as our dominant in the key of G major. We move to G major in first inversion on the next beat. We have B, D, G, and D. That takes us to C major in root position. C, D, G, and E. Always interesting to see a 9/8 suspension over a non-tonic chord, albeit G major is the dominant of C major, so maybe this is 5 of 4, but we don't have a dominant 7 here to verify whether or not the tonic is operating like a dominant, but we have another sort of indicator here to maybe point us in that direction, but I don't think it's super important. Anywho, passing tone in the bass, a little neighbor tone here in the tenor as well, before we get E, C, G, and C. It's taking our 4 chord and putting it in first inversion. Seeing 4 iterated over 2 beats is sort of C major-like, so maybe we do visit the key of C major here. I don't think it's very long-lived, though, because of the fact that we have F sharp on the next beat. E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have F sharp, D, A, and D, which is 5-6, first inversion, D major, D, is a chord tone, C is a passing seventh, F sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And that takes us to E minor, E, B, G, and D. More specifically, E minor 7 in root position, which is 6-7. Then we have some non-chord tones on the and of the beat. We have F sharp, we have A, and we have C natural, which is F sharp diminished in root position. We've had 2 root position diminished chords in this chorale, which is pretty interesting. No, actually, scratch that. This is the first root position diminished chord we've had in this chorale. I added a diminished root position diminished chord earlier when I had the score formatted incorrectly, because there was one in the tenor line when it was improperly inputted into the score, but I fixed it since then. Where were we? Yes, right here. We then have our tonic triad, G, B, A, and B. Very common to see 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads in root position. A little passing tone here in the tenor before we get... this just threw my brain for a loop because it looks like these should be moved over, but they're happening on the and of the previous beat. We have D, D, G, and A. G is a 4/3 suspension over our 5 chord. And I think this is actually a 5/7 chord, because by the time we get the resolution, D turns into C natural. So 5/7 or 5, I think, are both accurate analyses here. And that takes us not to G major, but to E minor, E, B, E, and G. Tonic sub-mediant triad in root position. And that's going to take us to the end of today's chorale. Ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. We start the phrase off with another E minor chord, E, G, E, and B. No need to reanalyze. That takes us to D major over F sharp with a 7/6 suspension in the alto, F sharp, A, D, and A. So that's 5/6. A little passing seventh here in the alto before we get G, G, B, and D. Tonic triad root position, passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor. Then we have E, B, E, and G, which is our 6th chord, E minor. A little neighboring seventh here in the alto, and then we have A, E, and C. You could analyze this as a 2 chord. Maybe 6 does want to go to 2, so that does make sense, but I think with a tonic triad on the other side, it's most likely like this E is actually functioning as an accented non-chord tone or an accented chordal 7th, and this is F sharp diminished over A, kind of like what's happening here, which is made even more complicated by the fact that it's being tonicized, but in this case it's not really being tonicized. Yeah, there's no G sharp in this chord, there's G natural. So 7/6 here. We then have G major in first inversion, like I had said before. B, D, G, and B. 1/6. Passing tone in the bass. We then have D major, it's our 5 chord. D, D, G, and A. Another 4/3 suspension over a dominant triad in root position. A little passing seventh here in the tenor before we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. That's today's analysis. I think really the big takeaway from this chorale is the little sort of modulation that we have here. It is a mid-phrase modulation, even though we end up going back to the key we started with, technically speaking. The beginning of this phrase is a little bit of an enigma. We have a tonicization of a chord that then sort of turns into a chord with a different function in the new key, and that morphing of 2 and 7 I think is something that Bach capitalizes on to create harmonic interest in his music, or it might just be a coincidence of the fact that 2 and 7 are close to one another because of the 6-7-1 movement that happens when the chords are close to one another. I think from a harmonic standpoint, it doesn't quite constitute a progression like I was talking about earlier, but you could analyze it as a progression if you had that opinion, if you felt like if one voice moved and it had enough of an impact on the harmony as a whole. That's totally fine. I think, like, for me, it's less of a progression and more of a morph of chords. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about in today's chorale. So I'm going to cap the video off on that. thought. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, we are closely approaching episode 400, which is wild, but it's going to be happening in the next month or so, which is very, very exciting. Feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon. You could also like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.